All right, I think that we can go ahead and get started. Mr. Wong, if you want to start off.
Sure. Well, let me welcome everybody. We're probably all hibernating in our houses, and I'd like to sort of like wish you all well. Let's begin by noting that U.S.-China relations are at the lowest points that they've been in more than 3 decades, probably since the Tiananmen uprising. The recent Pew survey showed that 2/3 of the Americans have a negative view of China. This is a very serious deterioration over the last few years. These pressures, however, have been building up for more than a decade, but they became more exacerbated with President Trump's election and President Xi's emergence as the most powerful leader since Deng Xiaoping. I'm an economist. I tend to look at US-China relations from an economic viewpoint. Here you have the two largest economies, the two largest trading nations. There's no lack of coincidence in the sense that the deterioration in tensions occurred with the economic rise of China. But as an economist, and let me speak for many economists, we see the US-China trade war and these tensions as largely counterproductive, illogical, but inevitable. It is counterproductive because both sides lose in the trade war. China loses more in the near term because it's more dependent upon trade. But America loses more in the long term because as an innovative economy, the frictions in decoupling is going to slow down China's US growth rates in the longer term. And I'll turn to that in a few minutes. Let me talk about why it is illogical. If you look at the US position, it consists of the views of the White House, the business community, and what I would call the security establishment. And these views taken together are in some ways unclear, but they're internally contradictory. The White House is mostly concerned about deficits, buying more soybeans. But most economists would point out that the trade deficit really doesn't matter. America's run a trade deficit every year for the last 40 years, and it will continue to run a deficit. And there's one fundamental reason why this will continue. It's the role of the dollar. As long as the US dollar is the global currency, it basically ensures that America will always run a trade deficit. And then if people talk about, well, why is it so large with China? Well, the answer is that most of East Asia's trade goes through China. It's like when you go to Costco or you order from Amazon, you buy it all from one vendor, but the products come from a variety of countries. So the trade deficit really doesn't matter, but that's what the White House is actually focused on. What about the business community? Well, the business community is largely complaining about what I would call unfair foreign investment practices. And China actually does have a lot of problems in this area. It is what I would call a legitimate concern. And what's the solution to this? Well, I think there's a lot that China could do to liberalize and reform its trade regime. But if it does do this, and US companies find that they can operate in China more easily, this will actually lead to more investment, more integration of the two economies. It will actually lead to an increase in America's trade deficit with China, which runs contradictory to the White House's objective. Then you have the security establishment. The security establishment largely sees these tensions as a great power battle for supremacy. And they favor cutting off exports, particularly of high-tech components to China. And at the extreme, they favor decoupling. But if you actually go this route of decoupling, it's actually going to hurt a lot the business community, because the business community actually would like to have greater access to China. But suppose you cut off the exports of high-tech equipment components to China. The Defense Department actually has come out and noted that this would actually make America less secure, because America's economic strength lies with its innovative companies. And if you look at these high-tech companies, they sell anywhere from 20, 30, 40, sometimes as much as 60% of their products to China. If they no longer can sell to China, their profits go away. And this accounts for the heart of America's innovative system. So from a security establishment viewpoint, you have a predicament here. If you don't export or continue to export these components to China, American companies no longer have the money to reinvest. In the longer run, America's competitive advantage in innovative activities is actually going to be basically be on a decline. But this is also what I would call an inevitable trade war. Both countries seek to elevate their profile. So here in the United States, Trump goes forward with America first. China has this vision, a so-called Asia dream. They both want to elevate their profiles in the global world. They both cater to populist sentiments. This creates a lot of the tensions. This is a problem that's not going to go away. And I think that many people are talking about potential Cold War and tensions. You know, if you go back 10 years ago, it would have been unfathomable to think that China could actually challenge America's position as the dominant global power. But from a Beijing perspective, they see a political and economic system which is under stress. And this has encouraged President Xi Jinping to basically move away from the policy that Deng Xiaoping had established decades ago, which essentially was to keep a low-key profile and to bide one's time. So President Xi is taking what I would call a much more assertive position. So what is the end game? What's likely going to happen in the coming years? Well, there are several possibilities. One is what I would call continued stalemate. Both sides basically moving between friction and trying to find a truce. You could also see a possibility for a compromise emerging in the coming years, but not many people foresee that. If this continues, you have a problem. And then if it's a problem that affects the world, like the pandemic, neither side is able to take the leadership role, you're going to find, I think, also Europe or Asia starting to becoming drawn into this controversy. So I think in sum, we have a lot of problems to deal with, and this is going to continue for many years. Let me stop here.
Thank you. Would you like to take the reins, Jeff?
Okay, well, welcome everyone. Hope you're having a decent experience as much as possible under the shutdown due to the virus and everything. And of course, the virus affects the relations between China and the US, which, as my colleague just pointed out, is one of the most pivotal country-to-country relationships in the world today, and has a lot to do with all kinds of discussions related to superpower relations, whether China is one now, is it going to challenge the US and seek to take over the US primacy? Is it a multipolar world? We'll talk about some of these things, and I'm sure during the question and answer period today too. But let me outline how busy China has actually been on the security side of things in terms of their military power expansion activities, in particular in the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean. But what we're most familiar with right now, because of news reports, are everything that China has been doing or not doing related to the coronavirus. So let me start there. I'll talk about two different kinds of Chinese strands of expansion. I'll talk about the new ones, and I'll talk about some of the older ones in two separate categories. First of all, we have the mishandling of the virus itself in medical and scientific terms. The doctor who discovered the virus, Li Wenling, was basically repressed by the Chinese authorities, and then, of course, got the virus himself and passed away early on in the fight for the pandemic in China. And you have all kinds of expert diagnoses, if you will, analyses. One by Southampton University pinpoints the exact costliness of Chinese delay and dithering over dealing with the virus. For example, had it done it 3 weeks earlier, it would have saved 95% of the deaths in China. 2 weeks earlier, 86%. 1 week earlier, 66. The second category we have is the aid that China has been ironically attempting to provide to other countries in the world, and how flawed that aid really is. We've seen China send PPE equipment primarily to Europe, but also to Canada, to the US, to Australia, other countries. And just when China, ironically, is attempting to turn around the public relations of its mishandling of the virus and score geopolitical points, it has failed to do so primarily by sending flawed equipment to these countries. And of course, there are costs related to this as well. In Canada, for example, 1 million masks were not workable. Hundreds of thousands of respirators were not. Same thing in Italy, Spain, Australia, and this goes on. Third category is the disinformation campaign that China is very actively waging during this virus period. So this is more akin to what Russia has been doing to the US and its allies in recent years. And some of this is quite surprising and new for China. I mean, specifically, using social media platforms to spread disinformation about the virus. A lot of Americans got text messages a few weeks ago alleging that Donald Trump was about to impose martial law on the US and send troops into the streets, among other things. The third category is really quite extraordinary, and that is the naval pressure that China is putting on countries that rim the East and South China Seas, most of whom are American allies, like Japan, Taiwan, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, etc. There have been an uptick in quite aggressive Chinese military exercises, both naval and aerial, right near Taiwan in recent weeks. We've also seen, we've had 3 major incidents of ramming of ships in the South China Sea in the last month. We had a Vietnamese ship sunk, we had a Malaysian ship sunk, and a Chinese ship actually rammed a Japanese destroyer. So even more critical in terms of the aggressive push out that China calls its maritime Silk Road, a kind of innocuous label, but the activity is quite aggressive. In fact, we're seeing a showdown as we speak in the territorial waters of Malaysia, where a Chinese ship is inside the territorial waters. It has been harassing some Malaysian ships that are doing oil drilling, and the US and Australia have just sent an expeditionary strike force very close to these ships in an effort to deal with that situation, the USS Barry, among others. And finally, there's the political pressure that the Chinese authorities have ramped up during this virus period. In Hong Kong, the top 15 pro-democracy leaders have all just been jailed in recent days. And we've also seen in the last month, just a couple of weeks ago, top journalists from the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, some of their best correspondents who've had decades of experience in China, were all banned from the country, including from Hong Kong as well. I'll finish with the older bits of Chinese expansion, which have relevance still today. One of those is the giant infrastructure building that China has been doing, used to be called One Belt, One Road, or OBOR, because that was viewed by the Chinese as an ineffective label. In more recent years, they've called it the Belt and Road Initiative. And this involves, it looked like early on for global South and developing countries, a lot of important aid from China, but a lot of it has involved debt traps, where Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, a whole bunch of countries also in Africa and Latin America are now in trouble because of the Chinese loans that are now coming due, and they've been handing over assets like ports and things like this. There's also been, as we all know, the buildup in the South China Sea of the uninhabited, formerly uninhabited islands, the shoals, the reefs, the atolls, and what have you. China just declared 2 new municipal districts in the South China Sea, and of course has military installations and the big buildup over the last 5 years on a number of these outlooks. And then finally, the intellectual property theft that occurred all throughout the Obama administration. Chinese intelligence officers, as well as some other groups, have stolen basically both commercial and military secrets from the US and its allies of a gargantuan order of magnitude. It's something that is still controversial because it was not deterred by the Obama administration. It continues today, and we see extraordinary things such as military to military visits when US generals will show up and they will see exact replicas of American ships, American planes, American tanks, etc., because of that stolen intellectual property. I'll say for the Q&A some bigger things about whether China is a superpower, whether it will become one, whether it will challenge the US, the role that Trump is playing in this, how he's exacerbating these tensions, and a few other things. So why don't we get moving with the discussion today?
Okay. So we do have a question that was written in here. Is there credence to reports that COVID-19 escaped from a Wuhan lab, in reference to Tom Cotton's Wall Street Journal piece? And I'll leave that up to either of you to answer.
Yukon?
Oh, let me.
His mic might be off. Yes.
Okay.
There he is.
Well, let me comment on this. There have been reports about whether or not the virus was escaped from a lab, because there is a lab in Wuhan. I've actually visited that lab because I was there during the SARS period of time. It does experiments on flu and the viruses. But there's no evidence that this is in fact the case. There's no evidence yet actually where this virus originated. People originally thought it came from that wet market in Wuhan, but it probably didn't actually, because now they realize that there were cases of this problem even in probably December, November, way before the wet market case. There are 3 strains of this virus actually, A, B, and C. And the interesting part is that people haven't realized that these strains have different severity and they have different paths. There's a B strain, for example, that's dominant in China. There's an A strain which dominates New York, which is much more severe, that came from Europe. The west coast of the United States has more of a B and the C strain, which is less severe, but it came from a different path. Most people think it probably migrated from animals in some way. And probably it did this even before it showed up in Wuhan. It probably came from a neighboring area, but we still don't know. So in essence, we don't know. It's something that people should actually examine. There's also the question about underreporting. There clearly is underreporting in China. But how big it is, we don't know.
Yes.
But there's underreporting here in the United States. People actually think there may be 5 times as many people in the US that has the virus than the current figures show. So this issue about whether or not China underreports, doesn't underreport, the answer, frankly, is the numbers in every country underreported. And did China basically hide? Hard to say. Remember, we still don't know today much about this virus. They're still learning how it's being transmitted, how severe it is, what is the death rate. This started in China. So when it first began, and it probably began in November, December, but no one even realized it. Only in January did some doctors begin to note this, but no one knew what this was. They didn't know whether it was transmitted from individual to individual. They didn't know how severe it was. They knew it was something very, very strange. In early January, China sent out the DNA genetic breakdown of this virus globally, because it said to everyone, here's something very strange. We don't know what to do about it. So to say that it was covering it up is kind of, to me, kind of a strange issue, because if they're really covering up, they wouldn't have sent out the DNA sample. They developed a test for this in early February, where everyone could basically find out whether they had it from 40 minutes or not. A scientist who actually used to be from the United States. To me, it's kind of interesting, because if that test had been freely available from WHO, if that test had been made available in the US, and it was available actually in early February, it probably would have saved tens of thousands of lives as America. But America wanted to develop its own. So basically, they asked CDC to develop one. Unfortunately, the first development of a vaccine, CDC, failed. So we lost maybe a month here. So this question about how does the country react? The answer is just think about this virus. We still don't know in the United States how bad it is. And people in every state react differently. So go back 3 months, and you basically have a system in one province. Even Beijing did not fully realize this. So there was a real mess, very lack of information. But I doubt that really should be characterized as a different cover-up. There's a lot of ignorance going on in this issue. Let me stop here.
I think that's true, Yukon, and certainly there have been just as many mistakes of a certain category by the US, by the Trump administration, and what have you. There's no question about that. And the response has been problematic, as you say, almost everywhere to various degrees. But there is something interesting, everyone. The Chinese Foreign Ministry and intelligence agencies have begun a new campaign that has a very interesting name. It's called the Wolf War Brigade. And basically, Chinese diplomats, ambassadors principally, those in international organizations, of the UN system, 5 of the head positions have Chinese officials in them. All of them are getting talking points how to aggressively pursue the public relations aspect of this campaign, to talk about China having great success fighting the virus, of helping the world, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, we can't forget this accusation that came originally from the spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministry that accused the US Army of actually bringing the virus to China. And this official had to make it an apology. But that has not helped at all, because the Trump administration has taken the bait, as Yukon was alluding to, and is exacerbating the dissolving of relations between these two important powers, and making things worse by targeting China. And it's happening with our Secretary of State, not just our president, and a few others. And that's also worth noting.
This issue of bad messaging, various spokesmen in China, you're absolutely correct. The foreign policy person putting out a warning that maybe America caused this, or the American military caused this, that was ridiculous. You find is what I call as many different kinds of what I call off-balance voices in China as you do in the United States. If you look at what people say in the US about the virus and how you deal with it, or even the briefings that come out of the White House, you go back a month or two ago, briefings which basically say that this is going to go away, we only have one case, is basically not very, very helpful. So what we have, I think, is a lot of what I call irresponsible messages coming out from both sides. And I think the problem we have is we don't have a unified way of sorting this out. WHO is potentially the source for doing this. But basically by saying from American side, we shouldn't be using WHO, we have a bit of a problem. After all, WHO, its scientific medical capacity actually is based upon 15 CDC doctors who work at WHO. And they're among the people who actually went to China and looked at this issue. So to basically say that WHO doesn't say the right thing, it's a great irony, because that what they say actually reflects in part what US CDC doctors basically are telling them what they should be saying. So I find this whole thing kind of ironic.
Okay, I'm going to, I don't know if you can see the questions that are popping up in the chat over here, but I'm gonna go ahead and read the second one here. Jared Levinson asked, if we are seeing escalating tensions between the US and China exchanging blame on the virus, how can we have confidence in the belief for global governance when a vaccine is reached, that our world can share this vaccine and the country to develop the vaccine will try and hold a power grip over it?
I can start on that one in the sense that it's an excellent question, very pertinent, because the premise is accurate, that relations are fraught diplomatically all over the world. The U.S. has abdicated its traditional leadership role with this administration. It's alienated lots of allies, not to mention rivals such as China. And we've got to have a lot of difficulty. There's another level of this, is that international institutions, starting with the WHO, but including the UN, including regional ones like the EU, and certainly the G20 and the G7, have been across the board largely ineffective so far in coordinating responses. The EU is probably out at the lead, and it's been late by months, especially in terms of how bad the virus has been, particularly in Spain and Italy, and lots of strains in that alliance. But just in the last couple of days, a giant package has come from the EU that will go out to all its member states. But when and if there is a vaccine, that there should be, that's what we understand from the medical professionals. Lots of different countries are working on it at the same time, and it would appear that we can at least be confident that it will be shared as quickly as possible. Whether or not there can be a kind of joint recovery effort, coordinated stimulus packages and that sort of thing, is probably a bridge too far.
Well, as the question indicates, we have a free-for-all, which is a real problem. If you go back historically, I think the U.S. played a lead role in handling these kinds of emergency situations, basically pulling countries together and drawing upon the skills of international agencies as appropriate. In this particular case, there is a need for a mechanism to coordinate the fact that vaccines are actually being developed by several firms throughout the world. So the U.S. has many trials going on. So does Germany, so does England, and so does China. It's good to have, I think, multiple attempts, because we don't know which ones will succeed. At some point, some kind of a subsidy has to come out, because there's some of these small companies, they actually don't have the financial capacity to do this. So we have a problem. The problem was a world where America basically coordinated these kinds of international catastrophes and crises. America doesn't really want to do that. We don't have international agencies that can do this. In theory, in the trade war, we should have been relying on the WTO to do this, but basically, America's lost its confidence in the WTO. America's also lost its confidence in the WHO. But in the past, if America had a problem with an international agency, basically what it would do is to work with other powers to sort of like say to the agency, you need to actually be strengthened, restructured in a certain way to fulfill these duties. In the current circumstances, we have a problem because America wants to withdraw its support. China doesn't have the experience, the depth of institutions to basically provide this kind of leadership. So now we have a particular vacuum. In my personal view, if this continues, you're going to have to see Europe playing a greater role, or in this particular case, also a more coordinated effort from other Asian powers. But that's going to take a long time.
What's fascinating, Yukon, I'll just say very briefly about the EU response. The EU has actually been cowed by Chinese pressure. It's an extraordinary outcome from my standpoint. I used to work in the European Union a number of years ago, and to see the EU back off from standing up strong to the Chinese disinformation campaigns that are active across Europe, and in the European External Action Service, the counterpart to the US Foreign Service, they've actually pulled a report on this that they were afraid would raise the ire of China, and they've denied that it actually exists. So this to me is pretty startling. It shows that China is actually having some success with its disinformation campaigns and the political pressure and geopolitical pressure that it's applying on others right in the middle of this virus period.
But Jeff, I would counter your point by EU actually pulls what it wants to say even more in terms of its views about the U.S. Their views of what's coming out of the White House and America's position on many things, they don't openly comment. But if you go out to Europe, if you ask them who they're more critical of, the votes would actually show they're actually more critical of America than they are of China. Now, if disinformation is coming from both capitals, when you think about other things, when they were creating, for example, an Asian infrastructure investment bank, America actively campaigned throughout Europe to say you shouldn't be joining, okay? In the end, everybody joined except for America and Japan. So this question of campaigning and putting out messages, I would say this is a problem from both sides. And the issue from both sides is you're going to have to get a global consensus to deal with these issues. If you have the two great powers fighting against each other, you can't get a great consensus. The logical format for achieving this might be the G20, because you have half major powers, you have half emerging market world. So my view in the future, you can't rely on the UN Security Council because the five great powers have veto powers. You can't rely upon the G7 because there's no emerging market economies there. You have to find a political organization where I would say the emerging world and the advanced world are both represented. And then within that group, the question is who's going to play a leadership role that's credible? The problem we have right now, of course, is neither America nor China can play that role.
I don't disagree with you there, Yukon, and certainly you have a great point about the behavior of the White House and the president himself exacerbating the tensions, throwing lots of accusations out there that are unfair and inaccurate. But that's different from having intelligence officers create propaganda that is designed to essentially create confusion in another country and even in a virus sense put people at risk. And that is a new thing we're seeing from Chinese intelligence services that is more akin to what Russia's been doing to the US and its European allies for years. So there is a difference, but in terms of the lack of its overall leadership in the world and not really having a proper global platform for this, I couldn't agree with you more.
That was really good points. Let me just move on to a couple more of these questions here, rolling in. What, if there is any, is there evidence that WHO tests are reliable and accurate? And are US and China medical scientists talking? Do the Chinese even have a Dr. Fauci that that we should be looking for?
Well, we have to realize that WHO, their technical capacity is essentially the technical capacity of its members. They themselves don't develop these various things. They basically support, but they draw upon the expertise in Europe, China, in America, and Canada as necessary. So that's an important question. So when we talk about working at WHO, in essence, we're actually working with ourselves as part of the group. China has infectious disease specialists, and many of them became quite experienced because of SARS 10 or 15 years ago. And the interesting question in China's case is this virus, when it came up in Wuhan, and it's very clear that the local authorities in Wuhan suppressed the information. They didn't quite know what was going on. They were caught in political campaigns and celebrations, so they basically were irresponsible. So an investigative team came from Beijing down to Hubei, Wuhan province, and they basically passed the message back up to Beijing. There's a problem down here. This is a serious issue. So they have what I would call their own Dr. Fauci, very, very experienced kind of a person. You have to realize that after the Beijing digested this, it took them about a week to digest this. But after they digested this, they basically said we're locking down the whole province. And that occurred in early February. So this is an issue. Ultimately, the political leaders, the people dealing with the medical and disease infections in Hubei, Wuhan, they were all fired. So clearly there was a problem. But the issue, if there was a cover-up, you wouldn't have had this. Wouldn't have had this kind of a investigative mission coming from Beijing and basically removing all the people responsible in the province who, in China's view, basically messed it all up.
Very informative. Rolling on here, you both sort of touched on this before, whether China is or has been trying to become a global power equivalent to the United States. Do you believe that COVID-19 has sparked or accelerated a Cold War with China? And can the United States remain hopeful China will act as a global citizen? I think, Jeff, if you want to kick that one off.
Sure, that's a great question, and one that we'll continue to ask ourselves in the coming years. And the answer is that China is already a regional power, for sure. It's the predominant power in Asia. We know that. And we know that it wants to become a superpower. And the interesting thing about this, before I answer the question of whether it is and whether we're in a Cold War with China at present, is one massive mistake that the US made back in the administration that I served. The Obama administration essentially made what I think historians will record as a grand strategic error. And they did it inadvertently, but they did it nonetheless. I actually would argue that the aggression that we see from Xi Jinping, the current Chinese leader, actually it stems a lot from how the US handled his predecessors. And what I mean by that is that China for a long, long time, going all the way back to the 80s, and Deng Xiaoping, the extraordinary Chinese leader who had great longevity in office and really is responsible for the economic powerhouse that China has become more than any other Chinese leader. He basically was the architect of a grand strategy that said, well, China does plan to become a superpower, but it won't actually challenge the US at that time, the USSR. It wouldn't actually challenge the current superpowers because China had made essentially a conclusion that both of these powers, the US in particular, were overstretched and basically were living beyond their means and would decline of their own accord without requiring China to actually challenge either of them, principally the US. Well, this all changed during the Obama administration, before Xi Jinping got into power, but the US made a very grave strategic error right when it was trying to, you all may remember the pivot to Asia that was probably the first foreign policy move out of the Obama administration. And that alienated Europeans who said, wait a minute, why are you pivoting away from us? And in essence, the Chinese very soon concluded that the US was attempting to contain it, just like it had attempted to contain the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Now, the US and some of my own friends in the State Department who worked on this more directly, I know for a fact, in personal terms and experience, that the US intention was to engage China. And so Kurt Campbell, who was in policy planning in the State Department, the architect of these policies, really did believe that, that the US was trying to be friendly and cooperative with China. And there was unprecedented engagement, hundreds, actually thousands of meetings across every agency. It went on for years. But the failure that I'm alluding to is precisely this. There were 5 military moves that the US made that China was threatened by. And in doing so, the US mistakenly gave China the reason to believe that it had malign intentions instead of benign ones. And these were 500 troops to Australia, basing rights for US submarines and ships in Vietnam and the Philippines, a massive radar installation on Okinawa Island in Japan, and the delivery of THAAD missiles to South Korea. So that was a mistake. And the upshot of that relates to the core of the question that was just asked. Why is China aggressively competing right now to the degree that it is? And it has a lot to do with the mistake that I just alluded to. And I would go so far as to argue that Xi Jinping might not even have been the Chinese leader if not for the perception of the Chinese government and strategic elite that they were basically being threatened by the United States, the reigning superpower of the day. And so in that sense, I argue, and this is quite controversial here because US experts have not gone this far, but I would argue that the US made Xi, and changed was the principal factor in China changing its grand strategy to what I referred to by the gradual rise plan of Deng Xiaoping to the rapid rise plan of Xi Jinping. And this includes actually being much more aggressive and being open to challenging the US, if not actually planning to. So I would predict that in the next 10 years, the US and its allies will be kicked out of the South China Sea at least, possibly the East China Sea, that there will be a military move on Taiwan that will really strain the US, whoever is in leadership at the time, of whether or not it will by treaty come to Taiwan's military aid. I'm afraid to say that's also in the pipeline. But in terms of whether China will be a superpower itself, I'll quickly wrap up this answer by suggesting that it ultimately will fail. And it will do so because of two principal reasons. One is that these days, at least in the last couple of hundred years, when democracy has been on the march around the world, to be an international superpower that's effective, you've got to be liked, you've got to be admired. And so your soft power has to be significant. You have to attract other countries, not just their governments, but their people and their aspirations. And China is failing to do that and will likely continue to. And the second reason, I'll wrap up here, is that China has a demographic time bomb that is in the process of going off. And that means that it won't have the ability to project military power in 10 or 20 years because its economic growth rate will go down quite substantially due to the low birth rate that has been in effect in China for decades. The one-child policy ultimately is going to be the great inhibitor of Xi Jinping's aspirations. I'll leave it there.
Well, let me comment, and I agree with many of the sentiments that Jeff said in terms of what is happening. China certainly is more assertive than today than it has been for 10 or 15 years ago. And basically, from a Beijing perspective, they would say this is commensurate with the fact we're now second largest economy. Another 10 years will be the largest economy. From their perspective, let me just point out something which I think from an American viewpoint would be fairly obvious. Go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. When Russia put missiles in Cuba, Cuba's a different country. But from an American perspective, that's a no-no. Why is that a no-no? Because the whole North America corridor is seen as America's sphere of influence. We cannot tolerate any kind of a military presence so close. So think about a possibility. Suppose Chinese warships regularly patrolled the Gulf, patrolled along the coast of California, the Atlantic, flew military reconnaissance flights, had bases in Canada, Nova Scotia, or Greenland. We in America would find this intolerable. We would say this is not unacceptable. But just think what they see. What they see is South China Seas, patrol boats, things going along in the between Taiwan, North Korea, South Korea, Okinawa. All these kinds of what I would call tensions, they're all in Asia. So from a Chinese viewpoint, they would say, why are you here? This is our sphere of influence. You have your sphere of influence, North America. I'm not going to get into that. That's your business. But you're totally over here. So China today basically says, this is different. We are different from what 10 to 15 years ago. And what they're really asking for is, can we have a situation where I will respect your sphere of influence and where North America, where you have, but you respect a little bit more of my sphere of influence in the sense that I have a greater authority. Now, from American perspective, this is a risk because they don't really trust China. And they basically feel that having a China there without a US presence is unacceptable in a security sense. But this is, I think, the tension. And that's not going to go away. Will China eventually be a great power? And I think the answer is, if it grows to 3 or 4 or 5% and you have 1.3 million people, it will be a great power. Power comes from both size and economic presence. But is it a military issue? Actually, most people think about this as military, nuclear. I'm an economist. Actually, that has nothing to do with the military. America's dominance of the world, comes from one thing that has nothing to do with the nuclear. It has the dollar. America controls the international financial system. All dollar transactions have to be cleared through the US Federal Reserve. All America has to do, if it wants to basically control China or push it back, is essentially say to China, I no longer allow you to use the US Federal Reserve System to clear your international transactions. So here you have any country totally dependent upon global trade. That's not like other countries, totally dependent. Economically, it's no longer viable. So as long as the dollar remains the dominant currency, which it will for the foreseeable future, this isn't an issue of security or military. It's really a question if does China want to get along in a way from an American perspective as a so-called responsible global power. And I think this is a serious issue to be debated.
So with that being said, and sort of sticking to the topic of economics here, just because it plays such a large part in the intertwining of the U.S. and China relationship. And you sort of touched on it a bit, Mr. Wong, is experts say that the coronavirus outbreak has brought China's extraordinary, nearly half-century-long growth to an end. It's a stark reminder of the enormous task ahead, as you've referenced, for the world to restart the global economy and to get to normalize relations. Was it actually the coronavirus that has brought China's economic growth to an end, or is it merely exposing an already fractured economic system?
Well, China grew at 10% a year for about 30 years. And then that growth rate peaked around 2012 or 2014. And then it's been gradually declining from 10%, and last year was 6%. If the coronavirus had not come, it probably would have grown at, let's say, 5.5% today. It's a maturing economy. An economy of China's size shouldn't be growing at 6% a year. Just think about it here in the United States. You're quite happy if we grow 2.5. So here's an economy almost the same size as America's. How could it grow at 6% a year when here we're struggling in the US to grow at 2? So it's an upper middle income country. Its growth rate's got to slow down. But the pandemic made the slowdown much more dramatic. And then the question is, does that mean that China, in some sense, economically, is much worse off or no longer able to deal with these great power issues? Well, think about the US. By the end of this year, the US growth rate will be minus 5%, maybe minus 6%. Major recession, very huge. China's growth rate this year will not be the 5.5 or 6% of last year, but the estimates are it's going to be 1 to 2%. It's going to be the only major economy that actually has a positive growth rate. Every other economy in Europe and the United States will actually have a recession. So China will account for 60% of global growth expansion in this current year, even though its growth rate is only 1 to 2%. And that is because the rest of the world is growing at minus 5%. So then you go forward. What about next year, the following years? This is a kind of an interesting question. Will China go back to 4 or 5 or 6%? And the answer is possibly. Or is it going to come down to, let's say, the 2 to 3% we see in the West? Remember, we're talking about coming down to 2 to 3% what we see in the West. Now, the interesting issue is China is very, very strange. It has all sorts of what we economists would call distortions and inefficiencies, things which are illogical, things that don't work very, very well. So the interesting question is, how is it an economy with all these kinds of distortions and inefficiencies can grow at 6%? That's too high, actually. So from an economic viewpoint, China's growth rate has actually been too high rather than too low. So here's the strange issue then. Suppose China actually addresses these distortions. If it actually addressed these distortions the economists have actually keyed in on, it could actually grow faster. So this is a question for the leadership. And many of these policies they have to do are politically sensitive issues. So China is one of the very unusual economies that if they actually did this or that, very simple things, it could actually grow by a lot more. But if it doesn't do some of these things, it actually could grow a lot less. And only time will tell whether it's going to be the positive, it's going to be the negative.
What's also interesting about that, I don't disagree with a word that my colleague said, but it's the long run where China is really in trouble. And why, despite the fact that UConn's quite right in suggesting that its rate in recent years has been coming down because it's a maturing economy. Ultimately, though, there's a factor there that has been absent in other OECD countries, and that is that the growth rate is going to be a major, or the birth rate, I should say, the low birth rate is going to be an immense drag on the overall Chinese economy. And I mean, it's going to be severe, not in terms of worsening everyday life for Chinese citizens, but curbing its ability to project major military power, certainly. So that is really something we'll be watching over time. Before I did international security earlier in my career, I did international economics, and it's fascinating to look at these questions. I think we're going to be looking at this one for quite a long time.
Let me point out that China certainly is an aging population and is an issue that they have to address whether it's a problem. It would have been a problem if we were really, really poor. It's less of an issue once you become what I call upper middle or rich. India, for example, is a very young population. It has a real problem because it's actually so young. It has all these young kids and people that can't find jobs. They got to feed them. So it's actually, that youth is a burden, okay? So China's got an interesting issue.
It's the inverse, yeah.
Population, but it's got something quite different from other countries with aging population. That aging population saves an enormous amount. So they don't create the same kind of social security burden that we worry about in the West. We worry that our pension systems aren't being funded. So Chinese save a fortune. So how does that savings show up? And this savings is done by old people and young people. Chinese households save equivalent of 30% of GDP. In the US, that number is 2%. The consequence is that China today invests 40% of its GDP, whereas in America, we invest 12. So when we come down fundamentally, why is it America only grows at 1.5 or 2%, or we don't have the rest infrastructure, or we seem to be having a problem, or our education systems seem to be underfunded? The fundamental answer is we only invest 12% of our GDP. Now, China, even though it's an aging population, invests 40. And no country invests that much. Now, most countries which tried can't do it because they don't have the savings. So they have to borrow or they have to go into debt. So China has very little debt. So this kind of aging issue is not an issue if you have the savings and you're able to invest. If you didn't, then the aging issue is a real burden. So it's not the same burden as you see even in Japan. It's more like a Germany or Switzerland. They have aging populations, but they still do extraordinarily well in terms of growth.
I think we agree more than we disagree on this point. I quite agree that in the short to medium term, it's exactly as you lay out. I believe that not only economically will China continue to be robust, but militarily it will as well. So if overall we're looking at in terms of the superpower measuring, it will continue to rise and essentially become something in between a middle power and a superpower. But that's where the savings, the diminishing returns to the savings that UConn refers to start to kick in, and where this demographic time bomb really starts to inflict real damage on the Chinese economy, that savings rate, and the ability to transfer the benefits of economic growth into military power. That's what we're going to be seeing in the long run.
All right.
One comment I would make as a representative security establishment is I think from an American perspective, I lived in the US for my whole life. So I've been in Washington for 70 years. This issue of power, maintaining America's power status, dominates the security establishment in America a lot. And I frankly don't think it's necessary because, as you mentioned, America has a tremendous advantage. It's well liked. Its institutions are strong. The dollar is the global currency. I actually don't think this issue of whether or not China's rising is a security threat to America. I don't think it is. I don't think it will be for the foreseeable 10, 15, 20 years. To me, that's not the issue. The issue for me is, how do you get two great powers to work in a way which is actually beneficial to the global world? And we don't have that right now. And part of that is the sense of a rivalry. And I think if the world thought less of, or tried to emphasize this rivalry, but actually focus a lot more about how do you get these two great powers to collaborate? A dominant power like America, which in my view will be dominant, as you say also, for foreseeable future, but a rising power which basically says, my voice should be increasingly heard, different. And how do we get these two groups, these two countries, to work in a way where I would say the world is better off? Right now, I think the world is worse off, and I think that is a real problem.
Well, touche, quite right. So there we agree in full. And there I also don't have an answer. That is extremely challenging. That is, if you will, the primary challenge before us. And I don't see immediate answers or solutions. But I think you would agree with me that we hope that future leaders will make different decisions and take advantage of opportunities to cooperate as opposed to compete.
Okay, well, I think that's a really good part to wrap up on. Do you have any last notes that you would like to make? Jeff or Yukon? I think that we've thoroughly discussed everything that's possible to give objective answers on for now without speculating the future.
Well, I appreciate the discussion and the debate, and unfortunately the short run doesn't look good because of some things that my colleague referred to. The incentives for these two leaders to continue to compete and compete even more intensively are going to grow. So I'm afraid in the short term, things don't look good at all. We're going to see more harsh accusations coming from both leaders, calling each other out. We're going to see the intelligence services also diplomats and military leaders all competing. And in the short term, the danger is going to be a clash, an inadvertent clash, or some sort of misperception on one side or the other. And then the problem could be the dangers of escalation. So that's what we need to avoid. Those are probably that's the principal security challenge before us, is for China and the US to work out confidence building measures economically, diplomatically, and most important, militarily. And then ultimately, I hold out hope, as my colleague does, that new leaders will find ways to cooperate, not compete.
Okay, well, thank you. I want to thank everybody for taking the time to log into our webinar today. I want to thank Mr. Wong and Mr. Stacy for their time. If you have any other questions that weren't answered today, you can always email us at info@nycfpa for any other information you might be interested in, or you can visit our website at nycfpa.org. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.